What kind of love could make a man trade his life for a stranger's, smiling as he stepped into the shadow of death itself? Good evening, dear listener. Wherever you are, by the fireside, in a quiet room, or preparing for rest, thank you for joining Saint Lives. Remember to subscribe, stay a while, and let the night carry this story softly to your heart. Tonight we follow the luminous yet harrowing journey of Maximilian Kolbe, a humble Polish friar whose faith, reason, and love for Mary transformed suffering into sacrifice, and whose final act at Auschwitz revealed the face of divine mercy among human ruins. The story of Maximilian Kolbe begins beneath a gray Polish sky in the small town of Zdunska Wola on January 8, 1894. The world he was born into was one of quiet oppression. Poland had been divided among empires, its name erased from maps, its people living beneath foreign rule. Yet within humble cottages and wooden chapels, faith was a language no ruler could silence. In such a home, amid poverty and prayer, little Raymond Kolbe was born to Julius and Maria, devout parents who taught their sons that life itself was a mission entrusted by God. From the very beginning, he seemed to live as though his soul already belonged elsewhere, his eyes bright with a kind of wonder that saw eternity in the ordinary. He grew up in a house where the rosary was as familiar as bread, where evening prayers rose like candle smoke into the cold air. The family had little, but they carried a treasure of trust in the Virgin Mary. Maria Kolbe often spoke to her children about purity, courage, and love for the Mother of God. Young Raymond listened quietly, his mind already reaching beyond the walls of home. There was a seriousness about him that even play could not loosen. His mother once said that he seemed born to ask questions only heaven could answer. Yet the boy's heart wasn't free from struggle. He was spirited and sometimes impatient, quick to anger when corrected, tender when forgiven. In those small moments of human weakness, grace began its silent work. Once, after being scolded, he went to his parish church and knelt before the statue of Mary. There, between tears and shadows, his life changed. He later told his mother of a vision. The Blessed Virgin appeared to him holding two crowns, one white for purity, one red for martyrdom, and asked which he would choose. In the fearless simplicity of childhood, he answered, "Both." From that moment, he lived as one who had already accepted both gifts, though he did not yet know their price. His early schooling revealed a mind both brilliant and devout. Teachers noted his memory, his precision, his longing for meaning beyond lessons. He spoke of becoming a soldier, yet not of earthly armies. The world around him spoke the language of war and occupation. He began to dream of a different kind of victory, one fought not with weapons, but with holiness. When he entered the minor seminary run by the conventual Franciscans at Lwów, he took with him that same mixture of youthful fire and deep silence. His parents blessed him, though their hearts ached with both pride and sacrifice. His father, Julius, would later join the Polish resistance and die for freedom. Perhaps, in his own way, he too carried the red crown his son had chosen. In the seminary, Raymond became Brother Maximilian, learning the disciplines of obedience, poverty, and study. Yet even as he swept the corridors or copied Latin verses, he dreamed of using modern tools, presses, books, technology, to spread devotion to Mary. Others saw a quiet student. Inside, a revolution was forming, one of prayer and intellect. He prayed long into the night, whispering that he wanted to be a saint and a great one. Such ambition was not for pride, but for love, the kind of love that desired nothing for itself. Outside the cloister walls, the world continued to harden. The early 20th century trembled with nationalism, industrial might, and disbelief. In Poland, faith was still the people's secret language of identity, and Maximilian began to see that to love God was also to serve one's nation, not through politics, but through truth. He would one day tell his friars that the task of every Christian was to conquer the world for Christ through the Immaculate. But those words were still seeds, waiting for their season. The young friar's devotion grew in quiet layers. His room was simple: a wooden cross, a worn Bible, a small image of Mary. He walked barefoot through corridors, memorizing hymns and formulas, but his mind wandered toward questions of science and the cosmos. Could reason and faith walk together, he wondered, like brothers on the same road? In that wondering, his vocation found its rhythm. He saw no conflict between invention and prayer. The universe itself was, to him, a reflection of divine order. Sometimes, in the hush before morning prayers, he would recall his childhood vision and feel again the gaze of the Virgin. Was she preparing him, even then, for the long road toward both crowns? In later years, he would say that true holiness was not a feeling of peace, but a decision renewed every day, to give, to forgive, to love without measure. As the first snows fell outside Lwów, Brother Maximilian wrote to his mother. His letter was simple, filled with gratitude and longing. He thanked her for her prayers and told her that he was happy, that he belonged entirely to God and to the Immaculate. It was the kind of happiness born not of comfort, but of clarity. He had found his purpose, though its cost lay far ahead, waiting beyond years of study, invention, war, and unimaginable suffering. Yet that winter, the path of sanctity was still a quiet one. The seminary bell called him to prayer. The world beyond remained unseen. In the stillness of those early years, grace wove its pattern through discipline and humility. The boy who had chosen 2 crowns was becoming a man who would carry them both. And as night fell over the silent chapel, his whispered prayer rose like breath into the cold. Mary, make me worthy of your Son. The child's faith had found its direction, though the road ahead would lead from peace to peril, from vision to martyrdom. In the cradle of obedience, the seed of sacrifice began to grow. The gentle rhythm of seminary life soon carried Brother Maximilian beyond childhood dreams into the deep waters of vocation. As the years passed in Lwów, he absorbed the quiet rigor of the Franciscan way, the humility of manual labor, the discipline of prayer at dawn and dusk, the quiet fraternity that bound young men together under the soft echo of bells. Yet even in this life of ordered peace, his restless mind could not stay contained by walls. He studied mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy with the same fervor as theology. To him, the laws of the universe revealed not a cold mechanism, but the handwriting of God. When others saw calculations, he saw psalms written in numbers. The fusion of intellect and faith became his lifelong mark, reason sanctified by wonder. Those who knew him then remembered a slender young friar with sharp eyes and a voice calm but charged with conviction. He spoke rarely, but when he did, the words lingered. It was in these formative years that the idea of the Militia Immaculatae, the Army of the Immaculate, took shape within him. The world beyond the seminary was shifting toward darkness, atheistic ideologies, militant nationalism, and the spread of materialist thought. The young friar watched this tide with sorrow. He believed that the Virgin Mary, as the one who had perfectly said yes to God, was the key to the renewal of the world. To consecrate oneself to her was to allow her to lead the soul to Christ, to disarm hatred with humility, and to answer violence with love. "We must fight," he would later write, "but not with swords. Our weapons will be prayer, knowledge, and the press." Even before he left for Rome, He was already drafting outlines for a movement that would transform devotion into action. In 1912, Maximilian was sent to the Eternal City to complete his studies at the Pontifical Gregorian University. For a young man who had known only the modest towns of Poland, Rome was an awakening. The grandeur of its basilicas, the thrum of voices from every nation, the ancient stones whispering faith's endurance, all this widened his soul. Yet amid the beauty, he felt the chill of modern skepticism. Anti-clerical pamphlets littered the streets. Secret societies paraded their banners against the church. It was here, witnessing a demonstration against the Pope, that his vocation sharpened into a mission. Standing among the jeering crowd, he prayed silently and vowed to respond. Not with anger, but with light. He and 6 fellow friars gathered in a small cell at the Collegio Serafico and consecrated themselves to the Immaculate, founding the Militia Immaculati on October 16, 1917, the very year of the Fatima apparitions. The timing felt providential, as if heaven itself echoed their prayer. Maximilian's intellect was matched only by his frail health. Tuberculosis began to shadow him. Coughing fits interrupted his studies and left him pale and trembling. But his spirit refused discouragement. He would later say that sickness was a teacher. It revealed how little one could rely on strength and how much on grace. When doctors urged him to rest, he used the hours of recovery to write articles and design pamphlets for the militia. Even then, his vision stretched beyond Poland. He dreamed of using printing presses, radio, even airplanes to proclaim the message of Mary's love to every corner of the world. "All means of progress," he wrote, "are means for the Immaculate." When he returned to Poland in 1919, the Great War had ended, and his homeland, after more than a century of partitions, was newly reborn. But freedom carried its own exhaustion. Poverty, disease, and moral confusion followed in the wake of battle. Maximilian, now a young priest, saw his people hungry not only for bread, but for hope. He gathered a few friars and began printing a small monthly newsletter titled Rycerz Niepokalane, the Night of the Immaculate. The first issues were printed on borrowed presses, the ink thin, the paper rough. Yet the voice within its pages was bold and clear. It spoke of faith, courage, purity, and the power of mercy to rebuild a wounded land. Readers multiplied. Within a few years, subscriptions reached tens of thousands. He accepted no payment for himself, living as poorly as his friars, often sleeping on the floor or working long hours in the press room, his habit stained with ink. By 1927, his vision outgrew the limits of the city. With land donated by a noble family near Warsaw, he founded Niepokalanów, the City of the Immaculate. It was not merely a monastery, but a living organism of prayer and production. Wooden huts soon gave way to brick workshops, a printing plant, a radio station, and quarters for hundreds of friars. The air rang with the rhythm of machinery and the murmured Hail Marys of workers at their tasks. Visitors who entered the gates felt they were stepping into another world, where technology served holiness and efficiency bowed before charity. Maximilian insisted that joy and discipline must walk hand in hand. Every action, from typesetting to sweeping the floor, was to be offered as prayer. He reminded his brothers that sanctity was not in grand gestures, but in the perfection of small duties. What made Niepokalanów extraordinary was not its size, but its spirit. While the world beyond its walls rushed toward political extremes, inside reigned serenity. Orphans were cared for, the poor fed, and the press continued to publish millions of copies monthly, reaching even to distant missions. Father Kolbe's energy seemed endless, though his body remained frail. When asked how he could accomplish so much, he would smile and say, Because I work for the Immaculate. She arranges everything. To his friars, he was both demanding and gentle, unyielding about discipline, yet tender in forgiveness. He believed that holiness must be efficient, that love should take the shape of order. As the 1930s unfolded, his fame spread. Invitations arrived from bishops abroad, asking him to establish missions. He felt a special call to the East, to Japan, whose people's devotion and discipline he admired. With just a few brothers and meager funds, he sailed across the oceans in 1930, trusting entirely in Providence. He carried with him a small statue of the Immaculate and plans for a new monastery. In Nagasaki, amid hills scarred by earthquakes and suspicion of foreigners, he found land and built another city of the Immaculate. The friars learned the language, printed local editions of their magazine, and won the hearts of many. Strikingly, the location he chose, against all advice, was on the sheltered side of a mountain. Years later, that decision would save it from the atomic blast that destroyed much of Nagasaki. In Japan, Father Kolbe discovered anew the universality of faith. He saw how the gospel could blossom within any culture when presented through love and respect. He often told his friars that every nation has its own melody in God's great song, and the role of missionaries was to listen as much as to teach. Illness returned often, but he treated it lightly. The body, he would say, is only the servant. Let it rest when it breaks. After several fruitful years, he returned to Poland, leaving the Japanese monastery flourishing under native brothers. Back home, Europe was changing once more. The shadow of fascism stretched across borders. Fear thickened the air. Yet in Niepokalanów, life continued with its peaceful rhythm of prayer and work. Visitors marveled at the orderliness, the kindness, the laughter even. Father Kolbe walked among his friars with the same calm composure, as though already aware that greater trials were approaching. When asked if he feared the gathering storm, he answered quietly, "Our Lady will have the last word." In those tranquil yet tense years before the Second World War, he often meditated on the meaning of his boyhood vision. The white crown of purity he had lived daily, offering his life in service. The red crown still waited. He did not seek it, yet he never fled from it either. His entire journey, from the child before Mary's statue to the founder of cities consecrated to her, had been one long preparation for a single act of surrender still to come. And so the friary continued to hum with devotion, its presses printing hope, while Europe armed itself for hatred. Nightly, as silence fell over the workshops, and only the ticking of machines remained, Maximilian would pause before the tabernacle, whispering his usual prayer, "Mary, take all that I am, all that I will be." He could not know that within a few short years, that prayer would be answered in a place beyond imagining. The seeds of the militia had taken root, and the man who dreamed of conquering the world with love stood ready, though the world itself was rushing toward darkness. The crown of martyrdom was drawing nearer, invisible but certain, waiting beyond the gates of war. When Maximilian Kolbe returned to Poland in the summer of 1936, his homeland seemed caught between exhaustion and feverish renewal. Factories were rising, newspapers multiplying, but beneath the bustle ran a deep anxiety. Germany's new leader spoke of purity and destiny in words that poisoned both. Maximilian sensed the approaching storm with a clarity born not of politics, but of faith. At Niepokalanów, the monastery he had built into a small city, he gathered his friars and told them that their mission would soon pass through fire. "Prepare not for comfort," he said softly, "but for endurance." It was not a warning meant to frighten, but to steady them for what he already felt within. The red crown from his childhood vision was near. Life in Nepokalanów moved with serene discipline. The presses ran day and night, publishing Reicher's Nepokalane and children's magazines that spread Marian devotion and Christian ethics through Poland and beyond. The friars rose before dawn for prayer, labored at machines that shook the ground like an organ's deep note, and then ended the day in silence before the tabernacle. They called Maximilian Father Guardian, though he lived more like a servant than a superior. His cell was bare, his meals smaller than the rest. Often he was seen sweeping floors, his habit streaked with ink, humming a hymn. Even in those years of rising threat, his letters radiated serenity. "Let us trust entirely," he wrote, "for no force on earth can extinguish love." But by 1939, the horizon darkened completely. News from the border grew ominous. Kolbe continued to print, not propaganda, but peace. The magazine carried appeals to prayer, to charity toward all peoples, even enemies. He refused to answer hatred with hate. In August of that year, as tensions reached their peak, he wrote a final editorial titled "Victory Through the Immaculate," urging courage and confidence that no war could erase the kingdom of God within each soul. Days later, on the 1st of September, German troops crossed the frontier. Within hours, Warsaw burned and Poland fell into chaos. Nepokalanów became a sanctuary. Refugees flooded in, soldiers separated from units, mothers clutching infants, Jews fleeing persecution, priests stripped of parishes. Kolbe opened every door, converting workshops into dormitories and kitchens into soup lines. The friars scoured nearby fields for food and bandages. When German officers arrived demanding that Jews be turned away, Kolbe refused. "We serve all who suffer," he said. It was a sentence that would soon cost him everything. In September, the Gestapo came for the first time. They seized the presses, arrested Kolbe and several brothers, and sent them to a camp at Amtitz. There, stripped of habits, they labored in fields until winter winds cut through their thin clothes. Yet witnesses recalled how Maximilian moved among prisoners like a lantern. He comforted the frightened, shared his ration, organized whispered prayers at night. When he spoke, men forgot the cold. "Hatred is not a creative force," he told them. "Only love creates." Released unexpectedly in December, he returned to find Nepokalanów ransacked but not broken. He gathered his friars again and began to rebuild. The following year, occupation tightened. The friary became a place of hidden resistance, though Kolbe never called it that. He printed leaflets of hope, coded messages of truth, and religious journals that defied censorship. He also hid dozens of fugitives, Poles, Jews, and soldiers alike, within the labyrinth of cellars. One night, when a neighbor warned him that the Gestapo knew, he only smiled. "Then we shall welcome them too," he said. His courage was not loud. It was the calm of a man already surrendered. In February 1941, the soldiers returned in trucks. This time there was no pretense of release. They stormed the monastery, seized the friars, and demanded to know who ran the press. Maximilian stepped forward without hesitation. He was taken first to Pawiak prison in Warsaw, where the air reeked of despair. His prisoner number was 670. Stripped of all possessions, he wore the same calm expression that had steadied his friars for years. He spent hours each day praying, whispering comfort to others, giving away his bread. When fellow prisoners despaired, he would remind them that even suffering could be offered for souls. "Courage, my friend," he once said to a trembling inmate. "We are already in paradise if we love." On May 28, 1941, the guards assembled a new transport. Maximilian Kolbe, now gaunt but unbowed, was among them. the train's destination. Auschwitz. The name itself would soon become a synonym for hell. The journey took hours in a sealed cattle car. Dozens fainted from heat and lack of air. Kolbe prayed aloud the rosary, leading even those who no longer believed. When they arrived, the guards shouted, dogs barked, whips cracked. Prisoners were herded into lines, their heads shorn, their clothes replaced by striped rags. Kolbe, the scholar and priest, became merely number 16670 burned into his flesh. Yet even then, witnesses said, he lifted his head and whispered a blessing. Daily life in Auschwitz was a slow crucifixion. Prisoners hauled stones, dug trenches, starved, and fell beneath blows. Kolbe was assigned to labor in the quarry, carrying heavy slabs until his lungs bled. The guards mocked his priesthood, beating him when they saw him pray. He endured it silently. At night, when men lay too weak to sleep, he crawled to their sides and murmured prayers. He heard confessions in whispers, gave absolution through touch. His presence alone steadied the others. He was like a ray of light, one survivor wrote. Where he was, fear disappeared. One evening, a prisoner escaped from Block 14. The camp's rule was merciless. For every escapee, 10 others would die in reprisal. Days later, when the man was not found, the sirens wailed and the roll call began. The commander stalked the rows, pointing his gloved hand at random. You, and you, and you. 10 men were chosen. One, a Polish sergeant named Franciszek Gajowniczek, cried out, "My wife, my children!" It was then that Maximilian Kolbe stepped forward. Removing his cap, he spoke with quiet clarity. "I wish to die for that man. I am a Catholic priest." For a moment, even the guards seemed disoriented. No prisoner volunteered for death. The commandant sneered but allowed the exchange. The condemned were marched to the starvation bunker, a dark concrete cell beneath the camp. The door clanged shut. No one expected sound to come from within, yet the guards soon heard hymns. Kolbe led the men in prayer, their voices faint but steady. Day after day, he tended the dying, raising the head of one who fainted, whispering the act of contrition. The guards, hardened to cruelty, began to listen in silence. After 2 weeks, only 4 remained alive. When the guards entered, they found Kolbe kneeling, eyes open, lips moving in prayer. Because starvation failed to kill him, the camp doctor was ordered to end it. On August 14, 1941, the eve of the Assumption of Mary, a syringe of carbolic acid pierced his arm. He made no sound. Witnesses later said that as the injection entered, he lifted his eyes as though greeting someone unseen. When his body was cremated the next day, the friars in Niepokalanów rang the bells at Vespers without knowing why. Kolbe's act spread quietly through the camps, carried by whispers of hope. The man he saved, Franciszek Gajowniczek, survived the war and lived into old age, telling the story to every listener. "I am the man for whom Father Kolbe died." In 1982, Pope John Paul II canonized him as a martyr of charity, declaring that his sacrifice had revealed the victory of love over hatred. But perhaps the truest monument lies not in basilicas or statues. It lies in the idea that even in the darkest places, light can still choose to shine. And so the boy who once saw 2 crowns had worn them both. His life, like a candle consumed by its own flame, illuminated countless souls. In a world that still wrestles with cruelty and fear, the memory of Maximilian Kolbe remains a question whispered through the centuries. What would happen if we loved one another with such abandon? After his death, the story of Maximilian Kolbe seemed destined to vanish into the smoke of Auschwitz, carried away with the ashes of countless others. Yet faith has a strange way of preserving memory, when the world itself wishes to forget. The prisoners who had survived began to speak of him in quiet tones, their voices trembling between reverence and disbelief. To those who had shared his starvation cell, he had been more than a priest. He had been a living embodiment of calm, a lamp flickering steadily even as all air was stripped away. One of them would later recall how, in the final nights, when thirst drove men to madness, Kolbe's voice sounded as though it came from another world. Soft, unbroken, murmuring prayers for the living and the dead alike. The guards, who were accustomed to the screams of agony, confessed that they dreaded opening that bunker, for what waited behind the door was not despair, but peace. It was said that even they, hardened by cruelty, removed their caps in silence. When the war ended in 1945, the ruins of Niepokalanów stood amid a broken Poland. The friars who returned found shattered presses, charred walls, and fields overgrown with weeds. Yet the spirit of their founder seemed to hover over the debris. They began to rebuild from scraps, collecting fragments of machines, salvaging paper, and setting the type once more. Before long, Reicher's Niepokalane was back in circulation, the same title that had once angered the occupiers. Its first post-war issue bore on its cover a single sentence that seemed to carry the weight of all that had been lost. Love alone remains. For the survivors, those words were not sentiment but testimony. They had seen what hatred could do, and they had also seen what one man's self-giving could undo. Franciszek Gajowniczek, the soldier whose life Kolbe had taken upon himself, returned to a home scarred by war. His wife had survived. His sons had not. The joy of reunion was pierced by grief, and he often said that he felt he carried two lives within him, his own and the priest's. For years he lived quietly, working as a caretaker in a convent, telling his story whenever someone asked, and often even when they did not. Each time, his voice would falter at the same point, the moment when Kolbe stepped forward and spoke those 9 unforgettable words. He visited Niepokalanów many times, always kneeling before the statue of Mary, whispering, "Thank you for giving me your son." The post-war decades were difficult for the Church in Eastern Europe. Communism sought to replace faith with ideology, to erase God from public life. Yet the example of Kolbe proved indestructible. His life had shown that obedience to conscience could outlast any regime. Among Polish Catholics, he became a quiet symbol of resistance, the saint of the human conscience, unarmed yet invincible. His story crossed borders, translated into dozens of languages, reaching seminaries and schools around the world. Artists painted him not with a halo, but with the thin, lined face of a prisoner. Writers described him as the patron of our dark century. In 1950, the process for his beatification began. Testimonies were gathered from every corner of Europe: survivors of Auschwitz, friars from Japan, nurses from the refugee camps. Each account told the same truth in different words: that Maximilian Kolbe had lived love as an action, not an emotion. One survivor described how Kolbe once traded his own portion of soup for another man's ration card, saying, "You need it more, my brother." Another recalled the night before the execution, when Kolbe, knowing what awaited him, blessed the guards and whispered, "We shall meet again in peace." These testimonies, collected and verified, painted a portrait of sanctity born not in vision or miracle, but in daily self-offering. As the Church examined his life, the friars of Niepokalanów continued his mission. The monastery grew again into a bustling center of devotion and communication. New printing presses rolled out millions of copies of religious journals, and the city of the Immaculate once more hummed with prayer and industry. Visitors came from far and wide to see the room where he had lived, and the cell that had been kept as it was, a simple wooden bed, a crucifix, and a small image of the Virgin. Pilgrims would often leave in tears, sensing that they had entered a place where suffering had been transfigured into something luminous. On October 17, 1971, Pope Paul VI declared Maximilian Kolbe blessed, recognizing him as a martyr of charity. The ceremony at St. Peter's Square drew thousands, including Gajowniczek, who stood among the crowd, tears streaming down his face. The Pope spoke of Kolbe's death as a victory won in the name of love over the powers of hatred and destruction. Yet the story did not end there. 11 years later, in 1982, under the pontificate of John Paul II, himself a son of Poland who had walked the same soil of occupation, Kolbe was canonized as a saint of the Universal Church. During the ceremony, Gajowniczek, then 81 years old, once again stood before the world, the living witness of a dead man's mercy. When the Pope embraced him, the crowd fell silent. For a moment, history itself seemed to exhale. After canonization, devotion to Saint Maximilian spread rapidly. He was named patron of journalists, prisoners, and those suffering from addiction. His image appeared not in triumphal poses, but in humble ones. A man in simple robes, eyes calm, often holding the two crowns of his vision. In Poland, his feast day became a national moment of remembrance for all who had perished in the camps. In Japan, the friary at Nagasaki, miraculously spared from the atomic blast, stood as a living relic of his faith in divine providence. There, the Japanese friars still celebrate Mass every August 14th, offering incense and prayers for peace in all languages. Over time, scholars began to see Kolbe not only as a martyr, but as a prophet for the modern age. His understanding that technology and media could serve the gospel anticipated the communication revolutions to come. His insistence that reason and faith must walk together offered an antidote to both fanaticism and despair. Above all, his life became a lens through which to view the mystery of suffering transformed by love. When asked why he volunteered to die, he had said simply, "Because I am a priest." Yet beneath that answer lay something deeper. The recognition that true priesthood means standing where others fall, offering one's own life as intercession. Even decades later, those who visit Auschwitz find that the story of Kolbe remains the most inexplicable of all. Guides lead groups to the cell known as Block 11, where the faint outlines of fingernail scratches mark the walls. In the corner, a small candle still burns, placed there by pilgrims. Many say that when they stand in that narrow space, a stillness descends unlike any other, something between grief and grace. The air seems to remember him. And perhaps it does, for love leaves a trace even where everything else perishes. In the years after his canonization, the message of his life inspired movements for reconciliation between peoples, especially between Catholics and Jews. His friars, acknowledging the universal dignity for which he died, established centers for dialogue and peace. When asked how they could continue his mission, one of them answered, "By never letting hatred speak the last word." That sentence might well be his true epitaph. As night falls in Niepokalanów today, the presses have long gone silent, replaced by the hum of prayer and the sound of pilgrims' footsteps. The chapel glows with candlelight. The air carries the scent of wax and incense. At the front, beneath a simple statue of the Virgin, rests a relic, a small piece of cloth from his habit. The friars sing softly the same hymn that once echoed in the starvation bunker. "Mary, we give ourselves to you." In that harmony of human voices, one senses the continuation of Kolbe's offering, unbroken across time. And so his life, which began in the obscurity of a small Polish village, continues to speak to a world still hungry for meaning. His death, far from being an end, became a revelation. That even in the place designed to annihilate hope, hope can still sing. Perhaps this is why his story lingers not as tragedy, but as invitation, to believe that love, when it forgets itself entirely, can still redeem what history has broken. The crown of martyrdom had been fulfilled, but its light spread beyond his death, reaching the wounded century that followed. His silence became a word, his death a seed, his memory a living call for the hearts that still dare to love beyond themselves. The world that St. Maximilian Kolbe left behind was no longer the same world he had been born into, yet his presence seemed to grow rather than fade. In post-war Poland, faith was both consolation and quiet defiance, a language whispered in homes when open profession could cost a career or freedom. To speak of Kolbe was to recall a truth that no decree could silence. The human soul remains free even when chained. Through the 1950s and 1960s, young seminarians studied his writings, finding in them a rare harmony between intellectual rigor and tenderness. He had written that only love is creative, and those words became something like a national psalm. To the exhausted survivors of occupation and persecution, his message was simple but radical. Hatred destroys not only its victims, but its bearer. Only love can rebuild what violence tears down. In Niepokalanów, the friary he had built from nothing, his brothers continued the rhythm of life he had shaped. At dawn, bells rang across the fields just as they had before the war. The friars rose for prayer, then worked in the workshops and gardens, printing small devotional magazines that still bore his name. Visitors came from every corner of Poland, and later from abroad. They came not as tourists, but as pilgrims, to walk the gravel paths he had once walked, to sit in the chapel where he had prayed before the tabernacle, and to breathe, for a moment, the peace that seemed to linger like incense in the air. The friars told them stories, not of miracles of power, but of quiet endurance, of how their founder had taught them that sanctity begins with small acts done with great love. One of them said, "He taught us that even the sound of a printing press can be prayer if the heart is pure." Across Europe, the Church sought to understand the meaning of his witness. The Second Vatican Council, convened in the early 1960s, spoke of the universal call to holiness, that every Christian, in whatever station of life, is called to the same perfection of charity. For many theologians, Kolbe embodied that vision before it was written. He was not a mystic removed from the world, but a man immersed in its turmoil, using every tool of his age to speak of eternal truth. His martyrdom, they said, was not an accident of circumstance, but the natural flowering of a life already given away long before Auschwitz. Meanwhile, the man for whom he had died, Franciszek Gajowniczek, continued to live as quietly as he could. After the canonization, he often traveled to schools and churches, holding a worn rosary that had belonged to Kolbe. "This," he would tell the children, "is my inheritance." They would gather close, listening to his halting words, understanding that they were hearing something that belonged not to history, but to the mystery of the human heart. He never tired of repeating that Kolbe had changed not only his fate, but his understanding of life itself. "He showed me," he said once, "that no one is beyond redemption, and that every breath we take after mercy is borrowed." When he died in 1995, his funeral was simple. On his coffin lay a small plaque inscribed with the number 1.670, the number Kolbe had worn in his place. Outside Poland, the ripples of Kolbe's sacrifice widened. In Japan, the friars he had founded near Nagasaki saw his intercession in their survival. After the atomic blast of 1945, the monastery on the sheltered slope of Mount Hikosan remained intact, while much of the city vanished in flame. For decades afterward, Japanese Catholics spoke of it as a miracle of providence, a sign that love, once given, protects even from afar. Kolbe became for them a bridge between East and West, a saint who had embraced their land not with conquest, but with humility. His statue still stands in their chapel, not robed in splendor, but in the plain habit of the missionary who carried peace in his hands. Each August, on the eve of his death and the anniversary of the bomb, candles float on the river as the friars pray for all who perish in war, friend and foe alike. Writers and philosophers found in Kolbe's story a counterpoint to the despair that had followed the 20th century's horrors. The French thinker Jacques Maritain wrote that in a world that had made the human person expendable, Kolbe redefined what it meant to be human. He restored, Maritain said, the image of God to man by reminding us that freedom is not the right to survive, but the power to give oneself. Others called him a modern Francis, not for poverty but for the radiance of joy amid suffering. Even those outside the faith were moved. A Jewish historian who had survived Auschwitz once wrote that Kolbe's act took place in the kingdom of absolute evil, and therefore must be called absolute good. Such statements did not seek to canonize him, but to understand how, in a place designed to extinguish humanity, one man could still act purely from love. In Poland, his example seeped quietly into the bloodstream of a generation that would later resist oppression again, this time under a different flag. The young Karol Wojtyła, who would become Pope John Paul II, often visited Niepokalanów as a student. He later said that Kolbe's life had taught him that holiness must be lived publicly, as witness. When he canonized Kolbe in 1982, his voice trembled as he called him a martyr of charity, a saint for our age of darkness and light. The image of the Polish Pope embracing the old soldier Gajowniczek became one of the most moving moments of his pontificate, a living parable of forgiveness and redemption before the eyes of the world. As the century drew to a close, Kolbe's name appeared in unexpected places. In hospitals, addiction centers, and prisons, chapels were dedicated to him. His story spoke to those trapped not by ideology, but by personal despair, the addicts, the forgotten, the imprisoned. His death had not been a moment of political defiance, but of spiritual solidarity, and so his patronage extended to every form of captivity. The lesson was always the same. No prison, whether of body or soul, can hold the heart that loves without measure. In the quiet of night, pilgrims at Niepokalanów still gather in the small museum that holds his relics. A fragment of his robe, a rosary twisted from wire, a copy of Ricoeurt's Niepokalane browned with age. They move slowly, whispering prayers. Some weep. Others simply stand in silence. Outside, the fields rustle with wind, and the same stars that once shone over Auschwitz glimmer faintly above. The friars often say that those stars remind them of his words. Beyond the clouds, there is always the light of the Immaculate. It is as if heaven itself continues the story, in the language of light. And so the life of Maximilian Kolbe, which began with a child's vision of 2 crowns, continues to unfold through the hearts of those who remember. His message is not confined to history. It remains a summons. In a time still torn by division and fear, his sacrifice asks a question that cannot be ignored. What would the world look like if even a few souls dared to love as he did? Perhaps his answer lingers in every act of compassion, every refusal of cruelty, every moment when someone steps forward quietly to bear another's burden. The ashes of his body were scattered, but the fragrance of his life remains. It breathes through the church, through the conscience of the world, through every heart that refuses despair. And in that breath, gentle as a prayer in the dark, Saint Maximilian Kolbe still speaks. The memory of Saint Maximilian Kolbe continued to unfold like a living psalm through the decades that followed his canonization, not as a monument of the past, but as a living fire that kept rekindling where the world seemed most desolate. In Poland, his name was spoken in whispers of gratitude by families who had lost everything, and yet somehow found courage to hope again. In schools, his story was read aloud to children who had never known war, but still needed to learn what love could mean when it costs everything. The friars at Niepokalanów, who now numbered in the hundreds, received letters from every continent. From prisoners, from mothers, from students and soldiers, each telling of how the example of the priest of Auschwitz had touched their own despair and turned it into prayer. They answered each letter patiently, enclosing a small card that bore his image. Thin, serene, the eyes of a man who had already looked beyond suffering and seen eternity waiting quietly behind it. Through the 1980s and 1990s, new movements within the church began to take inspiration from him. Lay men and women, moved by his spirit of Marian consecration, formed communities devoted to charity and evangelization. They called themselves Knights of the Immaculate, echoing his original militia, and their gatherings were simple: Mass, confession, the Rosary, and a commitment to works of mercy. What struck those who met them was not zeal, but gentleness. They carried themselves with the calm certainty that sanctity was still possible in a noisy world. Kolbe's teaching had always been that love must be creative, must find new languages for every age. And so his followers began to use film, radio, and later the internet to speak of forgiveness, to tell stories of courage and reconciliation. It was as though the presses of Niepokalanów had multiplied into 1,000 unseen channels of grace. The friary itself became both shrine and school. Pilgrims arrived by train and bus, by bicycle and on foot. Some came seeking healing, others came simply to say thank you. On quiet afternoons, the chapel would be filled with the low murmur of the Rosary in many languages. Old men from villages knelt beside teenagers from abroad. Nuns, factory workers, and children with flowers. The candles burned steadily, their light reflected on the small silver reliquary that held a fragment of his habit. The friars kept the place simple, just as he would have wished. The air smelled faintly of wax and fresh ink from the printing house that still produced devotional leaflets. At dusk, when the Angelus bell rang, a hush fell over the fields, and the sound of it seemed to travel outward across the countryside, calling the world again to remembrance. Elsewhere, the echoes of his life reached unexpected corners. In Rome, theologians studying the theology of martyrdom began to cite him as a turning point. Traditional martyrs had died for the faith, refusing to deny Christ. Kolbe had died because of love, taking another's place. His was the martyrdom of charity, the fulfillment of the gospel's words that no one has greater love than to lay down one's life for a friend, or even for a stranger. In that distinction lay something profoundly modern, a bridge between belief and humanity. His death became the answer to the 20th century's despair, that in the deepest night of cruelty, the divine image still glowed in man. The Auschwitz cell where he had perished became a destination of pilgrimage. Each year, thousands walked through its gates, reading the words, Arbeit macht frei, with a shiver of disbelief. Beyond the gravel yard, Block 11 stood silent, its windows shuttered, its corridors echoing with ghosts. Visitors filed down narrow steps into the bunker where he had prayed. The walls were cold to the touch, scarred with the scratches of fingernails. Yet among them, a small lamp burned perpetually beside a simple plaque bearing his name and number. Guides spoke softly, for the place itself seemed to demand reverence. Survivors who returned there said the air was still heavy, yet strangely peaceful, as if the horror had been absorbed by grace. Some lit candles and left notes of thanks. Others simply wept, unable to speak. It was as though every breath uttered in that cell continued to live, sanctifying even stone. As the new millennium approached, Kolbe's message began to find a fresh audience among people who had never stepped into a church. Writers and filmmakers rediscovered his story, not as hagiography, but as the tale of a man who remained human when humanity had collapsed. They saw in him a mirror for a generation weary of cynicism. Plays, documentaries, and novels retold the moment of his choice, each trying to understand how such serenity was possible. Yet what none of them could capture fully was the hidden simplicity behind the act. He had not planned to be a hero. He had simply lived so habitually in charity that when the moment came, it was the most natural thing to do. Holiness, his life seemed to say, is not an exception to the human condition, but its fulfillment. In 2000, Pope John Paul II included Saint Maximilian Kolbe among the martyrs commemorated in the Great Jubilee at the Colosseum, a circle of names spanning centuries and continents. The symbolism was powerful. From the early Christians thrown to lions to the victims of modern totalitarianism, one thread of love connected them all. On that day, the Pope stood beneath the ancient arches and declared that the blood of martyrs remains the seed of peace. The name of Kolbe was spoken among them, echoing against the Roman stones, his story woven into the universal tapestry of sacrifice. Over time, devotion to him took root in ordinary households. Small statues of the saint appeared in kitchens and gardens, often showing him holding the two crowns of his childhood vision. Families prayed for his intercession when a loved one was ill, when fear shadowed them, or when they simply needed courage to forgive. To many, he became the patron of those who face moral choices in everyday life. The nurse who stays late with a dying patient, the teacher who protects a bullied child, the stranger who steps forward when another suffers. His sainthood was not distant. It was domestic, woven into the quiet heroism of daily mercy. In literature and prayer books, one sentence of his began to circulate more than any other. Let us remember that love lives and grows through sacrifice. Those who repeated it often did not know where it came from. They only felt its truth. In that sentence lay the essence of his whole existence. That love, if it remains comfortable, is not yet love. His life reminded the faithful that suffering, when embraced with trust, is never wasted. It becomes a seed that yields compassion in others. As decades pass, the world still returns to him in times of darkness. When new wars break out, when cruelty resurfaces in old forms, his image reappears, slim, composed, unarmed, reminding humanity of another way. Perhaps that is why his story continues to feel contemporary. He is the saint of the age of technology, the priest who understood communication as an apostolate, the martyr whose act of mercy speaks to believers and unbelievers alike. His message is neither complicated nor outdated, that every human being is called to choose love, even when it seems useless. To choose it is to keep hope alive for all. And so, the voice of Saint Maximilian Kolbe still murmurs through history, not in thunder, but in the steady cadence of a heart that refuses hatred. His two crowns, once only a child's vision, have become emblems for the weary century that followed him. The white of purity, of conscience, of intention, of truth, and the red of sacrifice, the price of compassion in a broken world. Together they remind us that the path to heaven still winds through the fields of earth, through the small and the ordinary, through every place where one life can be given for another. The presses of Niepokalanów have long fallen silent, yet their music endures in the countless hearts still printing love into the world. The story of the man who died for a stranger continues its quiet march through time, not as history, but as promise. That even in the age of forgetting, holiness is possible and love will have the last word. Through the years that followed, St. Maximilian Kolbe's name continued to gather light, and his example quietly reshaped the Church's understanding of sanctity in an age that often mistook noise for power. His story became less an account of one man's death and more a reflection on what it means to belong entirely to God when the world around you demands compromise. In seminaries, young men read his writings on the Immaculate, learning that holiness was not a perfection achieved by will, but a surrender sustained by love. In convents and parish halls, women found courage in his unwavering trust in Mary's intercession, that maternal presence who had guided him from childhood vision to martyrdom. For a generation emerging from disbelief, Kolbe's life offered an antidote to cynicism, a demonstration that faith could still be intelligent, joyful, and gentle. Niepokalanów, once scarred by war, now breathed like a living body again. The friars who had survived rebuilt everything in the spirit of their founder, but they never tried to turn the place into a museum. The presses that once thundered with pamphlets now printed books, catechisms, and missionary newsletters. Trains stopped daily at the small station nearby, letting off groups of visitors who came to see not relics, but a way of life that had outlasted violence. They found no marble shrines, only quiet devotion. Friars working in the gardens, a boy sweeping the courtyard, the soft thud of typesetting, the smell of ink and candle wax mixing in the corridors. Above all, they felt the peace of a place where everything existed for a single purpose: to love through labor. At dusk, pilgrims often walked the same path Kolbe had walked between the press room and the chapel. The gravel crunched underfoot, swallows circled the steeple. Inside, the tabernacle gleamed faintly in the last rays of the sun. Sometimes a guide would recount his story, and silence would follow. It was not the silence of sorrow, but of recognition, each listener sensing that the saint's courage had somehow made room for their own. As candles flickered, the friars would chant the Salve Regina, and the words seemed to stretch across time. Turn then, most gracious advocate, thine eyes of mercy toward us. To hear it, there was to understand that mercy had indeed triumphed once on earth, and could do so again. Beyond Poland, devotion to Kolbe continued to spread like a quiet contagion of hope. In Italy, hospitals adopted him as a patron of those who served the sick. In Latin America, youth groups bore his name as a symbol of pure intention. In Africa, missionaries carried his story into villages where the memory of persecution still lingered. Even in secular circles, his life drew admiration. Human rights workers spoke of him as the conscience of the 20th century, proof that moral beauty can exist even amid systemic evil. A sculptor in France once said that when he carved Kolbe's likeness, he tried not to capture serenity, but the tension between suffering and peace. The paradox that made him human and holy at once. In Nagasaki, the monastery he founded remained a haven of reconciliation. Survivors of the atomic bombing came there to pray for the dead on both sides of the war. The Japanese friars often spoke of Kolbe as the saint of listening, for he had entered their culture not as a teacher, but as a learner, bowing before their customs with respect. On the 50th anniversary of the bombing, a delegation from Poland joined them, and together they offered Mass for all victims of violence. The bells rang, their sound mingling with the cicadas' hum, carrying across the valley like a pledge that compassion knows no borders. The friars of Nepokalanow also began new missions, seeing modern media as the natural continuation of Kolbe's apostolate. They launched radio programs, films, and websites that spoke of faith in the language of the day, always returning to the same refrain: that true progress is measured not by invention, but by mercy. In their studios, microphones replaced printing presses, but the rhythm was the same: technology harnessed by prayer. They often recalled his belief that the Immaculate would use every means, every discovery of human genius, to draw hearts back to God. His foresight seemed prophetic in an age saturated with screens. He had understood, decades before anyone else, that communication itself could be a form of ministry. Among theologians, the question of his martyrdom continued to invite reflection. Some called him a bridge between ancient and modern witness. The early martyrs had died professing belief in Christ. Kolbe died professing the law of love that is Christ's heart. His was not a death demanded by creed, but offered by compassion, a martyrdom accessible to all who act selflessly. In that sense, he belonged not only to the Church but to humanity. When Pope John Paul II called him the patron of our difficult century, he meant that Kolbe had shown how sanctity must adapt to an era where evil hides behind bureaucracy and indifference. Against such evils, the saint's weapon remained the same: a heart surrendered to the Immaculate, unafraid to serve, unafraid to die. In the years following the fall of communism, Poland rediscovered its saints as mirrors of its soul. Among them, Kolbe shone not for triumphs of war, but for victory of spirit. Streets, schools, and hospitals took his name. His image appeared in stained glass and roadside shrines, not as a distant icon, but as a neighbor watching gently over the passing generations. On national anniversaries, when veterans marched and choirs sang, the priests would invoke him as a reminder that the greatest patriotism is charity, that love of country must never eclipse love of mankind. In private homes, families passed down his story the way others pass heirlooms. Grandparents told their grandchildren of the friar who gave his life for a stranger. Children, wide-eyed, would ask, "Did he really do that?" And the elders would answer, "Yes, because he believed that every person carries God within." In that retelling, his sacrifice entered the bloodstream of faith, not as tragedy, but as example. His life became a kind of lullaby for the moral imagination, a reassurance that goodness is still possible even when the world seems irredeemable. As the 21st century unfolded, new crises arose, and yet his message remained startlingly relevant. In refugee camps, priests invoked him as protector of the displaced. In prisons, chaplains read his biography aloud to inmates who wept quietly, realizing that redemption had no expiry. In hospitals during epidemics, nurses pinned his small image beside their badges, whispering his prayer before entering wards of contagion. His witness had become a universal language that spoke wherever human dignity was at risk. It was the language of self-offering, the grammar of grace. Each year, on August 14th, the eve of the Assumption, pilgrims return to Nepokalanow. As evening falls, the friars carry a candlelit procession through the fields. They sing the old hymns he loved, their voices rising with the smoke of incense into the violet sky. When they reach the statue of Mary, the guardian of their city, the youngest novice reads aloud his final words: "Hatred is not a creative force. Only love creates." The crowd repeats them, softly at first, then louder, until the night seems to tremble with them. It is a ritual older than memory now, a conversation between heaven and earth. And somewhere beyond the noise of the world, perhaps, the humble friar who once dreamed of 2 crowns smiles again, his mission still unfolding. The story of Saint Maximilian Kolbe does not end with his death, nor with his canonization, but with the quiet conversion of hearts that continues in his name. He remains a witness that holiness is never obsolete, that mercy outlasts every empire, and that the smallest act of self-giving can redeem the vastest darkness. As the new century deepened and generations were born who had never known the thunder of war, the name of Saint Maximilian Kolbe continued to move quietly among them, almost like a secret blessing that had outlived all the noises of history. In the early years of the 21st century, Nepokalonov stood calm at the edge of the growing city, a cluster of red-roofed buildings surrounded by open fields where the wind carried the scent of pine and ink. The friars who lived there now were men who had never seen their founder, yet each spoke of him as if he had passed them in the hallway only yesterday. His portrait hung above the refectory door, not to be venerated but to remind them of the simplicity he had demanded. They still began the day as he had taught. In silence before the tabernacle, a silence that felt not like absence, but like beginning. It was from that stillness that they drew the strength to speak to a world increasingly allergic to silence. The monastery had become, over time, both refuge and crossroads. Every week buses arrived filled with pilgrims, families, students, priests, the curious, the weary, and those who carried invisible wounds. They came from across Europe, from the Americas, from Asia and Africa, each drawn by something they could not quite name. For some, Kolbe's story was a lesson in courage. For others, it was an answer to guilt, the assurance that even the smallest gesture of mercy mattered. They walked the grounds in reverent quiet, tracing the path from the gate to the chapel, from the chapel to the museum, from the museum to the garden, where a single oak tree had been planted in his memory. Beneath that tree, small votive candles flickered day and night, forming a constellation of gratitude that never went out. The friars rarely spoke of miracles, but they had seen transformations more subtle than any spectacle. The way bitterness softened into tears, the way restless hearts left lighter than they came. Inside the monastery's new media center, young friars edited videos and designed online catechisms. The gentle clicking of keyboards had replaced the clatter of presses, yet they knew they were heirs to the same vocation, to fill the world with words of faith. On the wall above their desks was painted one of Kolbe's sentences in large blue letters. "To love without measure is to live without fear." Visitors were often surprised by the modern equipment, the bright lights, the efficiency. But the friars insisted that their founder would have been delighted. He had always understood technology as an extension of the gospel's reach, another language for charity. When they broadcast daily prayers on the internet, they imagined him smiling somewhere beyond the veil, pleased that his mission still adapted, still spoke in the tongue of every age. Across the world, the figure of the Polish friar entered new landscapes of suffering and hope. In South America, communities named for him worked among prisoners and addicts, calling themselves Kolbe houses. In Asia, he was invoked by catechists who faced persecution, his calm courage becoming their pattern of endurance. In Africa, youth choirs sang hymns to him during Marian festivals, their drums and harmonies turning his story into song. Everywhere, his memory took root not as nostalgia, but as challenge, the gentle insistence that holiness is not an inheritance, but a daily choice. He had taught that true sanctity does not consist in visions or ecstasies, but in perseverance in love, when love seems useless. And so his devotees tried to imitate him in the smallest ways, by patience, by forgiveness, by noticing the forgotten. The miracle of Maximilian Kolbe was not that he died, but that he taught others how to live. Among theologians, reflection on his witness deepened. Some saw in him the image of the altar Christus, the other Christ who enters voluntarily into another's fate. Others described his act at Auschwitz as the highest form of Eucharistic imitation. He became bread broken for the life of another. In seminars and conferences, scholars spoke of the spirituality of substitution, the mysterious solidarity by which one life absorbs the suffering of another and transforms it. Yet even amid such lofty analysis, his own writings remained startlingly simple. "The measure of love," he had written, "is love without measure." Those few words, repeated endlessly, contained a theology more profound than entire volumes. It was as if he had stripped Christianity back to its original pulse: to give, to forgive, to serve, to surrender. In Auschwitz itself, the preservation of his cell became an act of reverence, shared by believers and unbelievers alike. Visitors entered slowly, as if afraid to disturb something still alive. The light was dim, the air cool and dense. On the rough floor, flowers and small crosses lay beside scraps of paper, petitions written in many languages. Some asked for healing, others for courage, still others only said thank you. The guides often paused before the iron door and allowed silence to speak. It was in that silence that many felt the faint presence of a man who had turned the darkest place on earth into a chapel of intercession. Outside, the fields stretched endless and quiet, but within, time seemed to halt. Those who entered left altered, carrying with them an awareness of what humanity can become when love refuses to die. Kolbe's message began to enter modern dialogues about dignity and forgiveness. Psychologists studying altruism cited him as evidence that self-sacrifice can arise not from instinct, but from a lifetime of interior discipline. Human rights advocates referred to him as the saint of conscience, arguing that his defiance of the Nazi machinery was an act of moral freedom that transcended religious boundaries. In ecumenical gatherings, his story became a meeting place where believers of different creeds could stand together before the mystery of goodness itself. Even those who did not share his faith found themselves moved by the serene coherence between his beliefs and his actions. In an era that mistrusted absolutes, his life offered one that seemed indisputable: that love, freely chosen, remains the final measure of truth. At Nepokalanów, anniversaries were marked not with pageantry, but with vigil. On the night of August 14th, the friars and pilgrims gathered before the chapel doors. The air was heavy with summer fragrance, the candles trembling in the breeze. They prayed the rosary, sang softly, and at midnight the great bell tolled, the same bell that had rung when Kolbe was alive. The sound rolled across the fields like a memory calling home. Some knelt, others simply looked up at the stars. It was said that on that night each year, a strange quiet descended, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. For a few moments, the boundaries between earth and heaven felt porous, as though the saint's gentle spirit passed again among his brothers, reminding them that death had never been the end, but the door through which love entered eternity. In the years that followed, his influence continued to ripple outward. When acts of terror struck cities, when refugees crossed seas, when despair threatened nations, his name surfaced again in articles, homilies, and quiet prayers. He had become a kind of compass for moral confusion, pointing always toward the same direction: compassion. His example whispered that the antidote to chaos was not power, but purity of heart. In that sense, he remained a revolutionary. the same visionary who had believed that ink and prayer could change the world. And perhaps they still can. The friars who tend his legacy say that miracles are simply love persevering beyond logic, and by that definition, his whole life remains one long miracle. As dusk falls over the monastery today, the chapel windows glow like small lanterns against the gathering dark. Inside, the brothers chant Compline, their voices weaving through the ancient psalm. "Into your hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit." The words that once accompanied Kolbe to death now rise again each night, returning to the heavens like breath returned to its source. Outside, the wind moves through the trees, and far away the trains pass, carrying travelers toward Warsaw, toward the future. Few of them know that not far from their route lies a city of peace, built by a man who believed that every invention of humankind could serve mercy. Yet perhaps, as the carriages hum through the night, a few hearts somewhere in the world still remember him, the friar who once stepped forward for a stranger, and in doing so stepped into immortality. And so the story continues, flowing beyond borders and years, carried wherever love is tested. For St. Maximilian Kolbe's lesson was never only for his time, but for every time. That in each moment of choice, the world is remade, and every act of self-giving becomes the pulse of divine life within creation. There is a strange serenity that follows a life completed in sacrifice, as if the soul that once burned through time leaves a gentle warmth that never quite fades. In the decades after St. Maximilian Kolbe's canonization, that warmth continued to spread quietly, crossing languages, generations, and even faiths. His story, carried first by survivors' testimonies, later by books and films, and finally by the invisible threads of the internet, became one of those rare human stories that belong to everyone. It was no longer the story of a Polish friar alone, nor only a Catholic narrative, but a universal meditation on the dignity of conscience and the mystery of love that refuses annihilation. What began as a single act of mercy in a concentration camp had become a living parable about what it means to be free. In the years following the fall of communism, Poland rediscovered its spiritual voice. Pilgrimages multiplied, parishes revived catechism, music, and art. Among the nation's saints, Kolbe stood as the most modern, neither hermit nor scholar, but a man of action who used the tools of his century to proclaim eternity. His example inspired lay Catholics to reimagine vocation beyond monastery walls. Teachers saw their classrooms as altars of service, journalists considered their pens instruments of truth. Doctors and nurses looked upon their patients with the tenderness he had shown the dying. A quiet revolution of conscience was underway, shaped not by slogans but by imitation. His words, "Only love creates," appeared on church doors, bus stops, and school notebooks until they felt like part of the nation's pulse. For the people of Poland, Kolbe had become not a memory of war, but a prophet of reconciliation. Elsewhere in the world, his life continued to find unexpected soil. In South Korea, a country once torn by its own war, he was revered as a model of unity. Statues of the saint began to appear in churches in Seoul and Busan, his delicate features carved with the same tenderness the Japanese friars had long captured. In India, Christian communities spoke of him alongside Gandhi, both men having lived the truth that peace demands sacrifice. In Latin America, youth movements dedicated to social service adopted his motto as their pledge, seeing in his gentle defiance a mirror of their own struggles for justice. And in the United States, where technology and faith often seemed to stand apart, his story was told as a bridge between them, the scientist priest who loved both the logic of creation and the mystery of grace. Back in Nepokalanov, The friars began to collect the stories of those transformed through his intercession. Letters arrived daily, some handwritten, others typed on glowing screens. They came from hospitals, prisons, refugee camps, universities, and quiet homes. A woman in Brazil wrote that she had forgiven her brother after 30 years of silence. A soldier in Syria wrote that he had found the courage to protect civilians because he remembered the friar who took another's place. A young addict from Mexico described how reading Kolbe's biography in a clinic had given him the strength to begin again. The friars catalogued these testimonies in thick binders that filled a small room off the cloister. They called it the Book of Fruits, not as proof of miracles, but as evidence that love once given never dies. It simply changes shape. Each August 14th, the eve of the Assumption, the anniversary of his death, the friary overflowed with pilgrims. Long before dawn, buses lined the country road, headlights piercing the mist. By morning, the fields were alive with prayer. Some pilgrims came barefoot as penance. Others carried photographs of loved ones lost in wars or sickness. At noon, the great bell of Nipokalanov rang, and the crowd fell into silence. In that moment, time seemed to fold in on itself. The year 1941 felt close enough to touch. A voice from the loudspeaker read the gospel passage that had defined his final act. Greater love has no man than this, that he lay down his life for his friends. Then, as the sun reached its zenith, thousands lifted their voices in the hymn Kolbe had loved most. Immaculate Mary, your praises we sing. The sound rose like a tide, washing over the fields that once held soldiers and refugees, now filled with families and laughter. It was as if the land itself had healed. The friars often said that Kolbe's legacy could be summarized in one paradox. He lived as though already dead to himself, and therefore could never be killed. His act of volunteering at Auschwitz was not spontaneous, but the natural consequence of 1,000 daily renunciations. A man so emptied of self that he could become a vessel for divine love. The more the world learned about him, the more apparent it became that his martyrdom had been prepared long before the camp. His tireless work at the printing presses, his illnesses borne with patience, his trust in Mary's guidance through every uncertainty, all had been rehearsals for the final offering. He had spent his life practicing the art of dying to self so completely that when the call came, it was not a leap, but a step. Among modern saints, Kolbe occupies a singular place. He is both contemplative and practical, both intellectual and mystic, both Polish patriot and citizen of the world. His love for the Virgin was not sentimental, but profoundly theological. He saw in her the blueprint of redeemed humanity, a creature whose only power was consent to God's will. To imitate Mary, for him, was to allow grace to act without resistance. That vision shaped his militia of the Immaculate, which continues today as a global family of prayer and service. Its members take simple promises: to consecrate their lives to Mary, to defend truth, to live charity, and to bring others to peace. Their numbers quietly exceed millions, though they claim no recognition. In that humility lies fidelity to his spirit. As the 21st century advanced, with its new forms of isolation and distraction, many found themselves drawn again to the clarity of his message. Retreat houses began offering Kolbe days, silent reflections on self-gift and surrender. Participants meditated on photographs of his calm face, read his letters from prison, and sat in stillness, asking what love might demand of them in their own time. Some returned home resolved to reconcile with estranged relatives. Others chose to serve in hospices or prisons. The fruits were quiet but real, small ripples widening outward. The friars said this was precisely his hidden miracle. Not dramatic healings, but the slow transformation of hearts. In recent years, theologians have begun to speak of Kolbe as a saint of communication, a patron for an age overwhelmed by noise. He had grasped that the gospel must be proclaimed not only in words, but in the very manner of being, with serenity, with precision, with beauty. His printing presses were not machines of propaganda, but instruments of dialogue. His articles were not polemics, but invitations to think. In an era of instant outrage, his legacy urges patience and listening. He believed truth persuades not by shouting, but by shining. Perhaps that is why his name endures while so many movements vanish. He had no agenda but love, no ambition but fidelity. At the heart of every reflection on him lies a single question that still unsettles the comfortable. Could we do what he did? Could we step forward when another's life hung in the balance? His answer, spoken once and forever, was not theoretical. It was action born of lifelong preparation. And yet he would remind us that sanctity does not begin in crisis. It begins in the ordinary. Washing dishes, setting type, bearing illness, forgiving small offenses. The grandeur of his death was the natural flowering of a humble life. For this reason, his example remains attainable. Every act of kindness, every moment of patience, every sacrifice made in love becomes a small echo of that day in Auschwitz. Even now, as the world faces new forms of cruelty and indifference, his voice continues to murmur through the conscience of believers and unbelievers alike. It tells us that no ideology can extinguish compassion, that no system can erase the divine image from a human face. To remember him is to be reminded that faith, stripped of love, is hollow, but love, even without recognition, is eternal. In that truth lies the quiet victory of his life. The story of Saint Maximilian Kolbe does not fade into legend. It lives in every soul that chooses love when fear would be easier. His life remains a whisper of courage across the ages, a proof that the light once kindled in the darkness can never be put out, because it no longer belongs to one man, but to the world he redeemed by stepping forward for a stranger. There are lives that do not end, but only widen, moving outward like circles upon a quiet lake, each generation touched by the ripples without fully knowing where they began. The life of Saint Maximilian Kolbe is such a life. Though his earthly story concluded within the suffocating walls of Auschwitz, his spirit continued to travel. Through nations, through time, through the hidden corridors of conscience. The 20th century, which had seen him die, spent its latter half trying to understand him. The 21st, born into its own restlessness, began to need him again. For Kolbe had become more than a saint of piety. He had become the interpreter of a world learning, once more, that love alone endures. Each year, pilgrims still arrive at Nipokalanov, that city of peace he founded with such improbable hope. They come not for spectacle, but for silence. Many step from the trains carrying invisible burdens, grief, guilt, confusion, and within a few hours find themselves breathing more freely, as if the air itself were lighter here. The friars receive them with simple kindness, offering tea, directions, and the reassurance that faith, like love, asks only for willingness. In the chapel, the light falls gently across wooden pews polished by decades of prayer. On the left wall hangs a photograph of the saint in his familiar round spectacles, his expression caught between thought and serenity. Beneath it, a single phrase. Only love creates. The words are unadorned, yet they hold the weight of an entire theology, the distilled essence of his life's work. Visitors who stay through the evening often witness the slow transformation of the place at dusk. The workshops fall silent. The last rays of sun touch the bell tower, and the community gathers for compline. Their chant rises like breath from the earth, psalms sung not for performance, but as continuation of a rhythm unbroken since their founders' time. For the friars, this prayer is not remembrance, it is participation. They do not look back toward Kolbe as toward a distant hero, but upward, in the conviction that he prays with them still. His presence lingers not as ghost or legend, but as atmosphere, an unseen steadiness that fills their days with purpose. Beyond the monastery, his legacy has taken unexpected forms. In cities across the world, parish soup kitchens bear his name, offering meals to the homeless and the lonely. Rehabilitation centers for those suffering from addiction call upon his intercession, seeing in his courage a model for endurance through recovery. Prison ministries distribute small prayer cards with his image, telling inmates that he, too, had worn a number instead of a name, that he, too, had known the stripping away of dignity, and yet had found freedom deeper than any cell could contain. These devotions are rarely grand. They are intimate, personal, born of the same compassion that once moved him to kneel beside dying strangers. His sanctity has become a language spoken quietly in hospitals, prisons, shelters, places where despair meets the first fragile flicker of hope. Theologians often remark that Kolbe's gift to the modern church was the restoration of moral imagination. In an age addicted to efficiency, he reminded believers that the smallest act of tenderness can be the most transformative. He lived his philosophy long before articulating it, when he bent to clean printing rollers, when he shared his meager rations, when he smiled at guards who despised him. His life demonstrated that sanctity is not abstraction, but discipline, a habit of seeing Christ in others until it becomes impossible not to serve them. He did not die because he sought suffering. He died because he had learned, after years of surrender, that the boundary between self and neighbor had disappeared. To die for another was simply to finish what love had already begun. In the years after his canonization, scholars attempted to frame his act in moral categories: heroic virtue, altruism, substitutionary sacrifice. But language kept failing. For many, the only adequate description was mystery. Something about the calmness of his gesture, the absence of bitterness or pride, defied analysis. Witnesses said that when he stepped forward, the camp itself seemed to pause. It was as if time recognized holiness in its midst and bowed before it. That moment, preserved in the trembling memories of survivors, has become one of the century's defining scenes. A man without weapon or defense asserting the absolute supremacy of love in a kingdom built upon death. The more distant that century becomes, the more luminous the gesture appears. Artists have tried to capture it, each in their own way. A sculptor in Krakow cast his likeness in bronze, gaunt, barefoot, one hand lifted slightly, as if offering not protest but blessing. A composer in Vienna wrote a requiem based on fragments of the camp's official records, letting the music rise from silence like breath after suffocation. Filmmakers, writers, painters, all have returned to that same moment, finding in it inexhaustible meaning. Yet the truest monument remains the one he built himself. Neopokhalanov, still humming with the work of faith, still producing words and images that invite humanity toward gentleness. Every printed page, every broadcast homily, every act of mercy that bears his name is an extension of his unfinished project, to fill the world with light. His connection to the Virgin Mary, which once puzzled even sympathetic observers, has gradually revealed its universality. For Kolbe, Mary was not merely object of devotion, but symbol of perfect openness to grace. She represented what the human soul could become when it stopped resisting love. In her humility, he saw the pattern of true strength. In her purity, the antidote to every ideology of domination. To consecrate oneself to her, he taught, was not escape from the world, but engagement with it in its most wounded places. That Marian vision now attracts people far beyond Catholicism, for it offers an image of humanity reconciled with itself, feminine, receptive, creative. In an era starved for tenderness, Kolbe's theology of the Immaculate Heart feels newly prophetic. Historians continue to find fresh resonance in his life. Some call him the saint of the atom age, pointing to how his monastery in Nagasaki survived the nuclear blast, as though mercy had wrapped it in invisible protection. Others see him as the precursor of digital evangelization, a man who intuitively grasped that faith must inhabit every medium. Environmental thinkers even invoke his sense of interconnectedness, the belief that creation, technology, and spirit are not enemies but collaborators when ordered by love. Each field finds in him a reflection of its own highest aspiration. The paradox of Kolbe is that his surrender produced influence, his silence became speech, his death birthed unending life. The friars who guard his legacy say that the truest miracle of their founder is the conversion of hearts that occurs without spectacle. A visitor enters burdened, skeptical, self-absorbed, and leaves somehow gentler, quieter, more inclined to compassion. They attribute this to what they call his contagion of peace. Even now, decades after his passing, that peace seems to linger like fragrance. To stand before his simple relics, a fragment of cloth, a rosary of twisted wire, is to feel the subtle gravity of goodness, the way it draws the soul upward without force. Those who come seeking reasons often depart with only one conclusion: love is stronger. And perhaps that is the essence of his message to our time. In an age of noise and suspicion, when ideologies harden hearts and technology both connects and isolates, St. Maximilian Kolbe stands as reminder that every life possesses infinite capacity for self-gift. He invites the world not to admiration, but to imitation, to live the ordinary with extraordinary love. His act at Auschwitz was the culmination of a lifelong conversation with God, a conversation that continues through every person who believes that compassion can still heal history. The night of his martyrdom has long passed, yet its dawn has never ceased to rise. His light remains woven through the centuries, a calm radiance over the chaos of time. And perhaps this is the miracle that endures beyond all others, that a single act of love, offered in the darkest place, can illuminate the world for generations yet unborn. The legacy of St. Maximilian Kolbe does not rest upon stone or bronze, but breathes in the quiet rhythm of hearts that continue to remember him. His story belongs now to the memory of the Church, in the same way dawn belongs to the horizon. It returns daily, quietly renewing the light. Decades have passed since his canonization, yet each generation seems to rediscover him, as if the world cannot move too far from the question he left behind. How much love are we truly capable of? Every age must ask it anew, and every age must answer with its own acts of courage. The friar who once bent over printing presses in Poland has become an enduring teacher of what it means to live freely in a time of fear. In the stillness of Niepokalanów, his presence feels almost tangible. Visitors often speak of a strange calm that settles upon them as they walk its paths, the same calm that must once have filled the friary when he was alive. The great presses, rebuilt after the war, no longer thunder with the same mechanical urgency, yet their spirit continues in the small printing rooms where friars design magazines, pamphlets, and digital newsletters. The air carries the scent of ink and candle wax, an unlikely fragrance of prayer and work intertwined. In the evenings, when the Angelus bell rings, shadows lengthen across the courtyards, and the brothers file into the chapel where the Eucharist glows softly under its veil. There they pray the same words he prayed, that love might fill every corner of the earth, that mercy might outlast hatred, that human invention might serve heaven rather than pride. The repetition of these petitions, day after day, year after year, has woven them into the very air. Among the friars, his rule remains simple. To live as instruments of the Immaculate means to accept obscurity, to serve without reward, and to see every soul as worth the effort of patience. They quote him often, not as doctrine, but as memory. A single act of love makes the soul beautiful forever. The novices who arrive each year learn that sanctity is less about achievement than about fidelity, the slow work of remaining kind, honest, and hopeful amid fatigue. They study his letters, marveling at the way he spoke of technology with awe rather than fear. To him, the printing press was a miracle, a modern pulpit. Today they see the same grace in microphones, screens, and satellite signals. His theology of communication, rooted in truth, simplicity, and beauty, has become the charter for their apostolate. They broadcast homilies across continents, reaching people who may never enter a church but still hunger for meaning. It is difficult for many modern minds to imagine the full scope of his dream. He did not wish to create an empire of publications, but a communion of souls. Nepokalanov was to be a city built upon prayer, labor, and the shared conviction that holiness is contagious. Even now, that conviction endures. The friary hosts retreats for young people who struggle to reconcile faith with a world of distraction. They arrive skeptical, their phones clutched like shields, and leave a few days later gentler, quieter, perhaps not entirely convinced, but at least curious again about grace. The friars do not preach loudly. They offer witness through hospitality, music, and the serenity of their rhythm. One of them once said, "To meet Kolbe today is to meet those who live as he taught." In that sense, the saint has never really departed. He simply multiplied himself through the lives of others. Beyond Poland, his message continues to find new translations. In Latin America, where devotion to him is widespread, murals depict him embracing the man he saved, their halos merging into one. In Africa, missionaries dedicate clinics and orphanages to his protection, invoking him as patron of mercy in places where poverty and illness still test compassion daily. In Asia, especially in Japan, his name is linked with peace. The monastery he founded in Nagasaki stands as both spiritual haven and museum of reconciliation. Japanese families who are not Christian still visit, drawn by the story of a man who built friendship instead of conquest. And in the West, amid the disquiet of modern society, his image hangs in university chapels, reminding scholars that intellect without charity is barren. Theologically, his significance deepens with time. The Church, reflecting on his act, sees in it not simply heroism, but a revelation of divine order, the imitation of Christ expressed in human form. When he took the place of another, he entered the mystery of substitution that lies at the heart of redemption. His gesture turned the logic of the concentration camp upside down. The camp existed to reduce persons to numbers. He answered by asserting that one soul could never be exchanged for another, except through love freely given. Thus, within a system designed to annihilate meaning, he restored meaning in its purest form. This is why, in the language of faith, his death is not called suicide or accident, but offering. It was the Eucharist enacted in flesh, the continuation of the Mass he had celebrated countless times, now consummated in the ultimate act of giving. Philosophers have written of him as a witness to the indestructibility of good. They note that even in a world built on violence, one voluntary act of mercy can alter the moral atmosphere forever. His decision, they argue, changed not only the lives within that bunker, but the very moral temperature of the century. It was proof that even under absolute oppression, freedom remains possible because love cannot be coerced. This insight has found echoes far beyond religion, in psychology, ethics, and political thought, where his name is cited as evidence that conscience survives even in the most dehumanizing systems. In this way, his sainthood has become a meeting ground between believers and unbelievers, between the language of grace and that of human dignity. Yet all these analyses remain, in the end, secondary to the simplicity of his example. His life continues to touch hearts not through complexity, but through clarity. A teacher tells his story to restless students, and for a moment the classroom falls silent. A nurse keeps his picture in a hospital ward, remembering him when exhaustion tempts despair. A prisoner in a crowded cell prays to him and feels, perhaps faintly, the same peace that once filled the starvation bunker. These are his true miracles, moments when love interrupts routine, when faith outlasts fear. Every August, the friars hold a night vigil on the anniversary of his death. Pilgrims walk by candlelight to the open field behind the monastery, where a large wooden cross stands against the sky. The stars are sharp in the darkness, and the wind carries the murmur of prayer. As midnight approaches, a reading is given from one of his final letters. Let us not forget, dear brothers, that love alone can transform the world. Then silence descends. No sermon follows, no music, only silence. In that silence, thousands of hearts seem to join his unfinished prayer, each person imagining the same act of surrender within their own lives. The night ends without applause. Pilgrims depart quietly, their candles still burning, the wax dripping over their hands like small, luminous wounds. They leave knowing that holiness, once witnessed, can no longer be forgotten. For the Church, St. Maximilian Kolbe remains not an ending, but a question that renews itself with every generation. Can we still believe that love is stronger than death? His answer, sealed in that bunker so many decades ago, continues to echo through the world's conscience. Each time a person forgives the unforgivable, each time compassion defies despair, his life begins again. And perhaps this is his truest canonization, not the ceremonies in Rome, not the statues or relics, but the silent continuation of his spirit in the countless ordinary souls who still dare, quietly and stubbornly, to love. The sun rises again over Niepokalanów, catching on the bell tower where his name is carved. The presses hum, the friars chant, and somewhere beyond the horizon, another heart decides to give rather than to keep. The circle widens once more, and the world, for an instant, remembers what it was created to be. By the beginning of the third millennium, the story of St. Maximilian Kolbe had long escaped the boundaries of church calendars and theology textbooks. It had entered the bloodstream of humanity, a living parable that returned whenever cruelty, fear, or despair demanded a counterword. The world he had known, torn by war, trembling under ideologies that sought to replace God with power, was gone. Yet new forms of violence, quieter but no less wounding, continued to haunt the soul of the modern age. It was into this anxious silence that his witness kept speaking, gentle as a candle's flame. He had proved that love could be creative even in annihilation, and that message remained urgent for a civilization that often mistook progress for peace. Pilgrims to Niepokalanów at the turn of the century began noticing the mix of old and new. The sound of bells mingled with the hum of computers, friars in gray habits walking past satellite dishes, the press room lit by screens instead of lanterns. Nothing here seemed to resist time, yet everything retained its original purpose: to make the invisible visible. Each morning, the friars processed to the chapel for adoration. Each evening, they returned to their workstations, translating homilies into new languages, digitizing archives, recording podcasts about faith and science. To visitors, it seemed paradoxical, a monastery humming like a newsroom. To the friars, it was continuity. Father Kolbe had once dreamed of using every invention for the immaculate. Now his dream simply breathed through fiber optic cables instead of ink and paper. When they prayed for his intercession before beginning their broadcasts, they did so with a confidence born of shared vocation, that the word of mercy must keep traveling farther than the reach of fear. Outside the monastery walls, his influence took quieter forms. Parish priests invoked him as patron of confession, teaching penitents that forgiveness is not humiliation, but freedom. In schools, teachers used his story to explain moral courage, how conscience can remain clear even when obedience demands compromise. In hospitals, chaplains told his tale to patients who had given up hope, reminding them that holiness often hides in the endurance of suffering. Each retelling carried new weight, adapted to the needs of the moment. To the elderly, he became the saint of memory. To the young, the saint of possibility. To the desperate, the saint of choice. His simplicity refused confinement. It expanded like light across water. Theologically, his martyrdom continued to challenge scholars. Was it purely altruistic or mystical? Could love of this magnitude be explained by psychology, or was it evidence of supernatural grace? Conferences and dissertations multiplied, yet all returned to the same conclusion. What he did could not be reduced to ethics alone. In Kolbe's gesture lay something sacramental, a visible sign of invisible charity that restored meaning to the very word human. He had revealed, more clearly than any argument, that the image of God within man is indestructible. Even in the mechanized cruelty of Auschwitz, that image had shone. It had chosen, it had loved, it had forgiven. And so his death remained theology's most eloquent sermon. Writers found in him inexhaustible material for reflection. Some called him the patron saint of the 21st century, for he embodied the reconciliation modernity so desperately sought between intellect and faith, progress and humility, individuality and communion. Novelists placed him in allegories where science met sanctity. Poets wrote of him as the quiet heart beneath the storm. Painters portrayed him with two crowns intertwined, one red, one white, set against the gray of barbed wire, a symbol that seemed to summarize the whole human condition. Purity tested by suffering, suffering transfigured into joy. Even those far from religion found solace in his story. To humanists, he proved that compassion remains possible amid degradation. To skeptics, that meaning survives even in the face of absurdity. Among his friars, the emphasis shifted from preserving relics to living the mission. They began opening small houses in cities where loneliness and poverty cut deepest. Places Kolbe would have recognized as modern battlefields for the soul. In shelters, they offered warmth and confession. In prisons, they brought education and Eucharist. In refugee camps, they distributed food and prayer cards. Each work bore the same inscription: "Only love creates." They repeated it as mantra and method. They taught that charity without creativity becomes routine, and creativity without charity becomes vanity. To combine both was to imitate their founder. And through these small works, the saint who once printed millions of magazines continued to publish his gospel of hope, this time written not in ink, but in deeds. At Auschwitz, the site of his martyrdom, the crowds never ceased. Every nation was represented among the pilgrims: Christians, Jews, Buddhists, agnostics, each drawn by the gravity of a story that transcended creed. The cell where he had died remained bare, lit only by a single flame protected behind glass. Some entered on their knees. Others stood motionless, unable to speak. Many wept not for sorrow, but for recognition, the realization that goodness is not an abstraction, but a choice that someone, somewhere, has actually made. Outside, the breeze moved through birches that had grown tall since the war. Birds sang in branches rooted in ashes. Life had returned, tender and insistent. The guides often ended their tours with the same sentence: "This is the place where one man proved that love is stronger than hate." No one answered. They simply nodded, carrying that sentence away like a fragile relic within their own hearts. Meanwhile, his homeland continued to invoke him during moments of trial. When floods devastated rural provinces, relief workers organized themselves under his patronage. When divisions arose in politics, bishops reminded the faithful of his example, how he had lived obedience without servility, patriotism without prejudice. His voice echoed through pastoral letters urging peace, dialogue, and compassion. Even those disillusioned with institutional religion felt kinship with his integrity. He had resisted corruption not by rebellion, but by holiness, and that, in every age, remains the hardest revolution. By the time the 100th anniversary of his birth was commemorated, the world that celebrated him was vastly different from the one that had condemned him. Technology connected continents in seconds. Human beings reached the stars. Yet the essential hunger remained unchanged: the longing for meaning, the fear of isolation, the cry for mercy. Kolbe's life answered those hungers not with ideology, but with presence. His message was not that suffering ennobles, but that love redeems. Not that death is glorious, but that life, when given, becomes eternal. He had built his theology upon the simplest of truths: that to lose oneself in love is to find oneself in God. That truth, whispered through the noise of a distracted world, continues to heal. In the quiet hours of night, when the last trains have passed and Nepokalanov lies still, the friars say they sometimes sense him near, the faint rustle of a habit, the almost audible hum of a prayer. Perhaps it is imagination, or perhaps holiness truly leaves traces, like warmth lingering in the air after a candle has been extinguished. Whatever the cause, they take it as consolation, proof that love, once kindled, never vanishes but remains diffused through creation. In that faith, they continue his work, confident that each small act of goodness carries within it the echo of his great one. And so the story endures, not bound to history but breathing within it, a reminder written into the heart of the world that mercy is never wasted. Saint Maximilian Kolbe's life, offered in silence and consummated in love, continues to turn darkness into dawn, teaching every generation the same eternal lesson, that to choose love, even once, is to let God be visible again in the world. By the second decade of the 21st century, the world seemed to be spinning faster than ever. Yet within that restless motion, the figure of Saint Maximilian Kolbe remained a still point. His story had been told and retold until it became less a tale of martyrdom and more a pattern of existence, a rhythm by which believers and seekers alike could orient their lives. The friar from Poland, who once dreamed of conquering the world for love, had indeed conquered it, but not through might or miracle or empire. He had done it quietly, the way light conquers darkness, by existing, by refusing to be extinguished, in cathedrals and online chapels, In prisons and small apartments, his name was invoked with the simplicity of breathing. People no longer asked whether his act had been extraordinary. They asked how they might learn to make the ordinary sacred. The monastery of Niepokalanów had by then become a living archive of his legacy, a place where centuries seemed to fold together. The old workshops were preserved, though new studios had been added, each room humming softly with computers, cameras, and microphones. Yet despite the modern sheen, the same serenity held the air together. The faint smell of ink and wood polish, the cadence of Latin prayers drifting through hallways, the echo of sandals against the floor. Pilgrims arrived daily from all languages and faiths. They came not merely to visit a shrine, but to experience a silence unlike any other, a silence that seemed to pulse with memory. The friars moved among them with patient smiles, answering questions, guiding tours, but more often simply listening. Listening, they said, had been their founder's first lesson. Kolbe had believed that every soul's story deserved reverence, that listening itself was an act of love. In his name, they practiced that art until it became second nature. At sunset, the monastery bells still rang with their deep bronze tone, calling the community to prayer. The sound rolled across the surrounding fields where wheat swayed in the evening wind, the same fields that had fed the friars in years of hunger. As the candles were lit inside the chapel, one could sense the invisible congregation of memory gathering. The countless men and women whose lives had been touched by his example, the unnamed victims of cruelty whom his act had redeemed in symbol, and perhaps even the man for whom he died, now long passed into eternity. In that light, the present and the past ceased to be separate. All time seemed gathered into a single heartbeat of peace. Beyond Poland, his influence had taken on dimensions that even his most ardent admirers could not have foreseen. Across continents, new religious orders and lay movements invoked him as their patron. His name appeared on hospitals and orphanages, on schools and charitable foundations. His story was taught in philosophy seminars as a case study in ethical freedom, in film schools as a lesson in the power of understatement, in interfaith dialogues as an icon of universal compassion. Even those who did not share his creed found themselves humbled by the coherence of his life, his harmony between intellect and humility, action and prayer. In a fragmented age, such wholeness felt revolutionary. In Japan, where his mission had first planted seeds of hope in the 1930s, the friary at Nagasaki flourished as a beacon of reconciliation. Visitors, Christians, Buddhists, Shinto, and those with no faith at all, came to walk its gardens and meditate on peace. The city's survivors of the atomic bomb often described the monastery as a living miracle, untouched by the blast, standing as proof that mercy can shelter even amid devastation. Every August 14th, on the eve of both the Assumption and his martyrdom, lanterns were set afloat on the river, each one bearing a prayer for peace. The glowing line of light drifted toward the sea, merging with starlight until no one could tell where earth ended and heaven began. The monk said that these lanterns were his message renewed each year. Hatred sinks, love floats. Meanwhile, in the West, Kolbe's example had begun to reshape how faith engaged with technology. The friars who followed his vision used the internet not as a fortress against the world, but as a bridge toward it. Through podcasts, online retreats, and live-streamed prayers, they reached hearts across borders and time zones. Each broadcast began with the same invocation. Through the Immaculate, let love create. Tens of thousands joined silently from their own homes, students in cities, farmers in the countryside, prisoners on contraband radios, the elderly confined to hospital rooms. For a few moments, they were all part of the same communion of listening. bound by the voice of a saint who had once used printing presses to achieve the same miracle. It was as if technology, which so often isolates, had found in him its opposite vocation: to gather, to heal, to humanize. The more the world changed, the more timeless his lesson seemed. When social divisions deepened, his story reminded people that true fraternity is born not from agreement, but from self-gift. When ecological anxiety filled headlines, his reverence for creation, his sense of technology as servant rather than master, offered an alternative vision of stewardship. When nihilism whispered that nothing matters, his life answered softly but firmly that everything matters, for everything can become an act of love. The paradox of Kolbe's influence lay in its gentleness. He convinced without commanding, converted without argument, conquered without force. His revolution was one of tenderness. Pilgrims who spent the night at Niepokalanów often described a certain dream that recurred among them. In it, they found themselves walking through a great field under a vast sky. The air shimmered with a light neither of day nor night, and in the distance they saw a figure in a gray habit, bent slightly as if in prayer. When they approached, the figure turned, smiled, and vanished into brightness. The friars did not interpret these dreams as supernatural, but as Grace's natural language. Perhaps, one of them said, he is reminding us that heaven is not elsewhere. It begins whenever one human being decides to love another. Even in secular culture, his presence endured. Exhibitions of his life toured museums. Composers wrote new works dedicated to him. Playwrights staged his story as metaphor for modern dilemmas of choice and conscience. Audiences wept not because they pitied him, but because they recognized themselves in his simplicity. Beneath the historical details, his message was painfully contemporary. In every system built on fear, someone must step forward for love. That invitation could no longer be confined to religion. It had become the moral DNA of humanity. As the century advanced, global crises multiplied: pandemics, wars, migrations, and with each came renewed attention to his example. During one such crisis, the friars opened their gates to shelter refugees and medical workers. A journalist asked why they risked infection, exhaustion, and loss. The prior answered, "Because our founder once walked into a place worse than this and found there the face of God. We have nothing to fear." His words circulated online, translated into dozens of languages, inspiring volunteers far beyond Poland. It was as if the saint himself had spoken through the calm voice of his sons. And so his light keeps expanding, moving quietly through the bloodstream of faith, through the veins of culture, through every heart that still believes in goodness. His name, whispered in prayer or studied in classrooms, remains a seed of hope planted wherever despair takes root. The friars say that every generation produces its own concentration camps, places where people are reduced to numbers, to statistics, to categories, and that every generation needs its Kolbe, someone who will step forward and say, "I will take your place." The forms of suffering change, but the remedy remains the same. At night, when the last pilgrims have gone and the monastery lies under a quilt of stars, the wind moves softly through the poplars that border the property. The bell tower stands dark against the sky, and beneath it the chapel glows faintly, a small heartbeat of light in the sleeping world. Inside, a single candle burns before the tabernacle, its flame reflected in the glass of a framed photograph. The gaunt face, the steady eyes, the gentle half-smile. The friars believe that this candle has never truly gone out since the day he died. They simply keep refueling it. As long as it burns, they say, the world still remembers that holiness once walked among us and proved that love is stronger than death. And so the journey of Saint Maximilian Kolbe continues, not as history, but as presence, a current of mercy flowing quietly beneath the surface of our time. His voice, carried in the hearts of those who dare to love without fear, still asks the same question that changed the world. Will you too step forward? In the later decades of the 21st century, the story of Saint Maximilian Kolbe continued to unfold like a river whose source never runs dry. Generations came and went, wars and peace alternated their turns upon the stage, but his name remained steady, luminous, undiminished. Children who had never known the sound of a printing press or the smell of ink still learned to whisper his motto in classrooms and parish halls, "Only love creates." It had become a proverb more than a slogan, an axiom for living that needed no explanation. In an age obsessed with speed and spectacle, the stillness of his witness spoke more loudly than any argument. The friar who had died nameless in Auschwitz had become the quiet companion of those seeking meaning in a world that seemed to forget how to listen. Niepokalanów itself, though surrounded by highways and cities, kept its quiet rhythm. The monastery's gardens grew wild around the edges, yet even the weeds seemed part of the design, bowing under the weight of dew as they had in his lifetime. Inside, the friars tended a small museum that preserved his few possessions: a rosary of twisted wire, a pair of cracked spectacles, the worn wooden sandals he had carried across the ocean to Japan. Visitors would pause before these relics, not out of superstition, but because they felt, in those humble objects, a glimpse of endurance. The friars reminded them gently that sanctity is always ordinary before it becomes extraordinary. "He was like us," one brother would say. "He worried, he coughed, he made mistakes. What changed him was not perfection, but surrender." And the pilgrims would nod, some in tears, recognizing their own unfinished stories reflected back through his. The fields around the monastery had once been farmland, but they had become a park now, a landscape of memorials, quiet paths, and groves of trees planted by pilgrims. Each tree bore a small bronze plaque engraved with a name or a prayer. The friars called it the Living Rosary, a chain of roots and leaves stretching across the soil. When wind passed through, the rustle of branches sounded like the murmur of Hail Marys. School groups often came to walk among them, led by guides who spoke of the friar's life with patient reverence, his boyhood vision of the 2 crowns, his love of study, his passion for invention, his defiance against hatred, his final act of mercy. Children listened wide-eyed, their faces lit by afternoon sun filtering through leaves. Some of them, perhaps without knowing why, felt a new gentleness take root in their hearts. That, the friars said later, was how miracles begin. Beyond Poland, the saint's presence continued to shape the conscience of humanity. In Rome, his writings were studied by theologians exploring the link between technology and holiness. They found in his reflections an astonishing foresight. He had predicted that communication would one day connect the world in an instant, and he had warned that unless guided by love, such power could dehumanize rather than unite. His remedy had been simple: to consecrate progress to the service of compassion. In that insight, scholars now saw the foundation for a new spiritual ecology, a vision in which invention and prayer, science and faith were no longer enemies, but partners. Universities began to host lectures in his name. Foundations for Ethical Technology quoted his line that, "The soul must be as modern as tomorrow and as faithful as eternity." Artists, too, found in him an inexhaustible muse. A Japanese filmmaker produced a meditative piece called The Cell, shot entirely in silence, its camera lingering on light filtering through a barred window. A composer in Poland wrote a symphony built on the rhythm of a heartbeat, ending with a choir whispering his words, love alone creates. Across continents, painters, sculptors, and poets returned to him whenever they sought to translate suffering into beauty. His life had become the archetype of redemptive love, the assurance that pain need not end in bitterness, but can become the raw material of grace. Even secular art critics spoke of him with respect, calling him the saint of the human condition, because he had transformed atrocity into compassion without ever surrendering to despair. Among the faithful, his intercession continued to be invoked for the most fragile and forgotten, the imprisoned, the addicted, the abandoned. In hospice wards, nurses kept his small image near the bedside of the dying, whispering his prayer when words failed. In refugee camps, aid workers called upon him as patron of displaced souls. In classrooms, teachers used his story to teach empathy in a world where children often met violence first through a screen. His life had become a curriculum in compassion. To learn about him was to learn that every human being carries within them a spark of divine possibility, and that to love another is to protect that spark. In time, his memory began to inspire not only devotion, but dialogue. Jews, Muslims, Christians, and non-believers gathered at Auschwitz each August to honor his sacrifice as a shared human inheritance. They read aloud the testimonies of survivors, prayed in their own languages, and kept a minute of silence in the cell where he had died. The silence spoke louder than any sermon. It was the silence of awe, the recognition that goodness, when absolute, transcends every boundary. That small room, once a tomb, had become a womb of reconciliation. Those who entered it left gentler, as if the air itself had changed them. When sunlight streamed through the narrow window, it seemed to carry his voice, not in words, but in presence. Within the church, his influence continued to grow. Popes quoted him in encyclicals. Bishops invoked his name at peace conferences. He was held up as the model of a new kind of sanctity, active, intelligent, creative, missionary, yet rooted entirely in prayer. He had shown that holiness was not withdrawal from the world, but engagement with it through love. His Marian devotion, once dismissed by some as sentimental, now appeared prophetic. In a century marked by wounded relationships and fragmented identity, his theology of consecration, to live through, with, and for the Immaculate, offered healing. It invited believers to rediscover tenderness as strength, humility as victory. He had seen in Mary not escape from suffering, but the courage to stand beside it. That insight became his enduring gift to the modern heart. On certain anniversaries, pilgrims would gather in the open field behind the monastery for what they called the Night of Gratitude. They would light thousands of small candles, arranging them in the shape of a cross that stretched nearly the length of the grounds. From the sky, it must have looked like a constellation fallen gently to earth. As darkness deepened, choirs began to sing the same hymn that had echoed through the starvation bunker 80 years before. The melody rose softly at first, then swelled until it seemed the air itself might break under its weight. Old men wept. Children pressed their faces into their mothers' shoulders. The friars stood among them, heads bowed, murmuring the rosary. When the singing ceased, a great hush fell, a silence alive with presence. It was as if the whole world, for one breath, remembered what it was created for. And when dawn came, the candles had melted into wax pools glimmering on the grass, their smoke curling upward like prayer. The friars gathered the remnants, saying quietly that nothing given in love is ever wasted. They would melt the wax anew for next year's vigil, shaping it into fresh candles, letting light rise again from what had already burned. It was the perfect symbol for the saint they honored, love continually reborn from sacrifice, creation springing from what the world called destruction. As the century pressed on, and humankind faced challenges Kolbe could never have imagined, machines that thought, climates that trembled, societies that drifted from truth, his witness remained strangely contemporary. He had not offered a program, only a presence, yet that presence contained everything essential. He had taught that the answer to dehumanization is always the same: to remember, to revere, to love. And so his name endures, carried on the lips of those who refuse despair. Somewhere tonight, in a city high with neon, a nurse whispers his prayer before beginning her shift. Somewhere in a forgotten prison, an inmate recalls his courage. Somewhere in a classroom, a child writes an essay that ends, "St. Maximilian Kolbe showed us that even one life, freely given, can change the world." Thus his story continues, luminous and unending. The story of a man who turned hatred into a hymn, who proved that love can outlast history itself. The candle still burns in the chapel of Niepokalanów, and its light, reflected across the world, shows no sign of fading. For every age that remembers him will find again what he found first, that in the heart offered to others, God still dwells. The years continued to unfold, and the world kept changing its face, cities rising higher, machines growing smaller, hearts often running faster than the days themselves. But the memory of St. Maximilian Kolbe remained strangely unmovable, like a chapel built at the crossroads of eternity and time. The noise of modern life, with all its lights and doubts, seemed only to deepen the need for his quiet example. People no longer came to him seeking miracles, they came seeking meaning. For in the simplicity of his gesture, one man stepping forward to die for another, they recognized the answer to every question that progress had left unanswered. In Poland, his homeland, his feast day had become both national reflection and family ritual. On the morning of August 14th, bells tolled across the countryside, their sound mingling with cicadas and summer wind. Children carried flowers to parish altars. Old women recited his litany in cracked voices that trembled, yet did not fade. In Warsaw, Kraków, and Lublin, processions wound through the streets, candles flickering beside digital billboards, ancient chant blending with traffic noise. The contrast was jarring, but somehow beautiful. The sacred woven through the ordinary, the past breathing through the present. In every parish homily, the same theme returned: that love, to be real, must cost something, and that courage begins not in grand moments, but in daily faithfulness. Niepokalanów itself had grown into a sanctuary that defied classification. It was monastery and media center, museum and mission base, a city of silence nested inside a world of speed. Pilgrims still arrived by train, though the line was now electric and the carriages sleek. They still walked the gravel path to the chapel, where the same crucifix hung above the altar. The friars had learned to guide visitors through the contradictions of modern devotion, smartphones filming relics, tourists pausing mid-prayer for photographs, the sacred and the trivial existing side by side. Yet they were not disheartened. They believed, as Kolbe had believed, that grace can find its way through any noise. Even the camera, one friar joked gently, is only another form of light. In the archives, scholars worked tirelessly to digitize the saint's writings, his articles on science, his meditations on the Immaculate, his letters from Rome and Nagasaki, his notes scrawled in the margins of engineering manuals. They were astonished by the breadth of his intellect: physicist, theologian, linguist, strategist, dreamer. He had once calculated the weight of the earth, and then written on the same page, "All this is dust beside the value of a single soul." His synthesis of reason and faith became a blueprint for new thinkers who sought to heal the rift between belief and knowledge. A century after his death, his sentences felt less like relics and more like prophecy. In Nagasaki, the friary he founded remained untouched by war and earthquake alike, its white walls gleaming on the hillside above the harbor. Each spring, cherry blossoms drifted through its courtyards like pink snow, settling on statues of Mary and on the stone inscribed with his name in both Polish and Japanese. There, monks and laypeople gathered for the Rosary of Peace, their voices alternating languages, the refrain merging until no one could tell one nation from another. "We pray not for the absence of war," their leader explained, "but for the birth of compassion." Kolbe's message had outlived nationalism. It had become the anthem of a global heart. Artists kept returning to him, as if drawn by an inexhaustible magnet of beauty. A choreographer in Vienna staged a ballet called The Two Crowns, its dancers moving between shadows and white light to depict purity and sacrifice entwined. A poet in Chile wrote a cycle of sonnets comparing Kolbe's cell to the womb of the world, where humanity learned to be reborn. In Paris, an architect designed a chapel whose roof opened to the sky in the shape of two intersecting circles, red glass and white, so that sunlight passing through cast a crown of living color upon the floor. Everywhere, the symbol of the two crowns reappeared, reinvented, resonant. It seemed the world could not exhaust its need for his paradox: holiness as creativity, death as renewal. Among theologians, debate softened into contemplation. They no longer argued about the definition of his martyrdom, but about its meaning for an age without faith. How does one imitate love in a time when love itself is suspect? The answer, they found, lay in his humility. Kolbe had never sought recognition. His greatness was the natural consequence of fidelity. His sanctity was not spectacle, but rhythm, the slow, patient offering of each moment to God. That rhythm could still be lived anywhere, in the family kitchen, in the hospital corridor, in the endless meetings of modern life. To imitate him, one need not die. One only needed to begin again each morning with gentleness. The friars taught this in retreats that attracted both believers and skeptics. They invited guests to spend 3 days without phones, walking, working, and praying in silence. On the first day, most participants fidgeted. By the third, many wept. They spoke afterward of rediscovering the beauty of time, the sense that life was not a race to be won, but a gift to be received. Some returned every year, saying the experience had changed their way of seeing. The friars, humble as ever, credited not themselves, but their founder. "He still teaches," they said simply. "He always will." Meanwhile, historians continued to uncover stories about the man he saved. Franciszek Gajowniczek, the Polish sergeant who had cried out for his wife and children on that day in 1941. Gajowniczek had lived until 1995, spending his last decades traveling the world to speak about the priest who took his place. His testimony, preserved in countless recordings, remained one of the most haunting echoes of the 20th century. "I could only thank him by living," he had said. His survival became part of the saint's continuing miracle, the redemption of one life through another. Each time his words were replayed, listeners were reminded that love does not erase suffering. It transforms it into meaning. In recent years, psychologists began citing Kolbe's act as a study in altruism beyond instinct. Neuroscientists, measuring the brain's response to empathy, quoted his writings on self-forgetful love as evidence that spiritual conviction can rewire perception itself. His name entered textbooks on ethics. His face appeared in documentaries about moral courage. Yet even as academia analyzed him, the simplicity of his message persisted unchanged. Every human being is capable of infinite tenderness, and tenderness, multiplied by faith, becomes redemption. The friars at Nepokalanów aged, died, and were replaced by others. The presses changed again, from digital to whatever came next. Yet each generation carried the same prayer into the future, that they might love as he had loved. Sometimes, when storms swept over the plains and lightning flashed behind the bell tower, they imagined his spirit still pacing the corridors, whispering the rosary under his breath, reminding them that obedience is freedom and that nothing given to God is ever lost. They never tried to prove such things. They simply lived them. As the century turned once more, humanity stood on the edge of challenges Kolbe could never have foreseen. Climate shifts, artificial minds, a loneliness more widespread than hunger. Yet his presence remained a compass, pointing toward the same horizon he had always seen, the triumph of mercy. His relics rested quietly beneath the altar at Nepokalanów, but his true relic was the conscience of those who remembered him. To read his life was to feel the world slow down, as if time itself bowed to listen. And in that listening, hearts discovered again the meaning of sanctity, not an escape from the world, but the courage to love it as God does, even when it breaks. Thus the story comes full circle yet never ends. A boy once dreamed of 2 crowns, and in choosing both he became the bridge between heaven and earth. His footsteps echo still in every act of kindness, every decision to forgive. Every soul that remembers love is not weakness, but creation itself. Saint Maximilian Kolbe remains what he has always been, the quiet heartbeat of mercy within the noise of history, whispering across generations that love, and only love, will have the final word.